This episode is brought to you in partnership with Neonic Training Solutions. Neonic run a student-led physiotherapy clinic based in Shipley, Bradford. Neonic provide placements for a range of healthcare students, offering supported direct patient contact coupled with additional learning opportunities. This creates a unique placement package that can give your confidence and professional development a huge boost. If you're in the Shipley Bradford area and would like to get some help with an injury or a long-term condition, then Neonic may have the solution. Everyone can get a free first appointment advice, and then any subsequent 5 appointments would only cost a total of £20. Neonic offer extremely affordable physiotherapy service, and if you're worried about seeing a student, check out their 5-star Google rating. The students have time dedicated to concentrate on you and are supervised by expert physiotherapy practitioners that have a wealth of experience from a broad range of backgrounds. If you'd like to find out more about their services, whether that's from either a student or a patient perspective, you can find more at neonic.co.uk, and we'll leave a link in the show notes.
Today we're joined by 2 newly qualified physiotherapists who both graduated from the University of Bradford this summer. So we're joined by Esme Dodwell and Meg Brown. So hi guys, welcome to the podcast.
Hiya.
Hi Brad, thanks for having us.
Yeah. Okay, so just to start us off, I just wondered what have you both been up to since graduating? So Esme, we'll start with you.
Since graduating, went and did a 5-week sort of like international placement in the Philippines. When we came back from there, I was just a gym instructor, and then I started my Band 5 rotational physiotherapy role with Leicester Partnership Trust. So and then awesome. I've been doing that since,
Cool. What's your first rotation?
In long-term conditions, so pulmonary rehab and cardiac rehab.
Awesome. How are you getting on? You getting on all right?
Not too bad, thanks. I'm sort of about 4 months in now, so finding my feet a little bit now. It's good, really enjoying it.
Oh, awesome. Good to hear. And Meg, how about yourself?
Yeah, so I, over the summer, I've been working with Lancashire County Cricket Club, and I was also part of the 100 with the Manchester Originals. So in that, I sort of worked across both the men's and the women's teams, supporting the lead physio with recovery, to make sure the lads were fit to play, basically. And then I've just accepted a Band 5 rotational position with Northern Care Alliance. So I'm hoping to be starting that in the next couple of weeks.
Awesome. Sounds really good. Okay, so I'm sure as you both know, but for the listeners, this podcast episode is going to look about looking at dissertations again. So you two both did a research project. So could you just introduce sort of what you did, why you chose that title, and why it's important to you? So Meg, we'll start with you.
Yeah. So my dissertation was on the impact of COVID-19 on the learning experiences of physio students. So I chose this topic because obviously when we came to pick our titles and things, it was obviously quite relevant. We were currently in the pandemic and we were obviously going through that as students. So I felt it was quite relevant to us. We'd obviously experienced quite a lot of changes to our learning through the pandemic. For a lot of like my peers, we all found it quite challenging. So I thought it'd be quite interesting to sort of look into what those changes were and the impact that it had on us throughout COVID. And obviously when I sort of did some background research, there wasn't anything similar within physio. There was some research in nursing students and medical students, but nothing specific to physio. So I thought it was going to be quite interesting.
Okay, and Meg, is there any other sort of parts to conducting the research project that you'd like to add on to that?
Yes, I think for us at our university, we obviously had to do a research proposal of the year previous. So obviously part of that is putting together what you actually want to do for your research, so how you're going to conduct it. So whether you're going to do a questionnaire or a focus group or a mixed method study. So part of the proposal included actually doing a draft questionnaire for myself, because that was what my study was based on. And obviously, as Esme already mentioned, putting together like participant information and a consent form. And then once you've actually got your ethical approval, it's a case of obviously finalising how you're going to conduct your research before you then go out and sort of get your participants. So for me, I did a pilot study as part of that, and then obviously went on to then recruit my participants through sort of like social media channels, and also using my lecturers to send out emails and things to try and get people involved.
Awesome. I think we've just lost Esme there, but we'll see if she jumps back in. So, oh, there she is straight away. Look at that. So, if we zoom in on ethics, nice to have you back, Ez.
Sorry.
If we zoom in on ethics, how did you both find the process of applying for ethics for your research projects? We'll go to you first, Meg.
Yeah, so I think it's actually I found it quite intimidating. Initially, you sort of get the form, which is formulated by the ethics panel at your university, and it's obviously something that you've never done before. So you initially look at the form and think this is going to be quite stressful. So I think obviously discussing it with your dissertation tutor to make sure that you sort of understand the form before you start submitting it, and then just try and take as much time as you've got for it. Make sure you go through each thing and make sure you've sort of met every aspect of the checklist to prevent it coming back. It is quite time consuming, but for me, it was quite straightforward just because my topic wasn't anything quite sensitive. It was, quite a straightforward topic. It didn't include using sort of service users. It was using students at the university. So mine was quite a simple process, but I know that other people found it a bit more challenging.
Yeah, I think the difference between the one that we had to fill in for literature reviews and the one that you guys had to do with the full ethics checklist, I think it's definitely something to put a lot of emphasis on, isn't it? When getting it done quickly, making sure you've got that approval, because before you've got that, it's very hard to actually go forward and make progress. And like you said, they might send you it back with loads of changes to make. So the quicker you get it in, and if you prioritise that, the quicker you can be moving on with it. What about you, Esme? How did you find the process of applying to ethics?
Long as well. Can very much agree with Meg on a lot of points there. It's a long process, and it can be kind of daunting, when you speak to your sort of dissertation tutor and they sort of start to tell you what kind of things they're expecting for your ethics, you start to realise the sort of like sheer quantity of work that's sort of like coming, if that makes sense. It was one of those things that when I was discussing with my dissertation tutor, they sort of said, just start it over summer and just get cracking with it. Just because we need to get this in before realistically I started my 4th year. So yeah, very, very lengthy process. And obviously there's a lot of things that you sort of had to include, as I sort of mentioned earlier. So, once that was done, again, like Meg, you just got to get it in, try and do it as well as you can with the first sort of time you submit it, because again, if you don't meet all the criteria, I know I had some slight wording problems the first time I submitted it, so I had to just clarify that I was doing a discussion instead of an interview on a couple of my pieces, and then finally it was sort of like approved. So yeah. But yeah, no, the biggest thing there is like if you're doing something like what we did at uni, just try and get it done as soon as possible, if you can, because it just helps in terms of the long run.
No, absolutely, yeah. So if you are starting up a research project, I think the biggest tip is get it in early, get on with it quickly, because you never know how long it's going to take to do. And I know a lot of some people are waiting late into January to get their ethics back, so it's definitely something to really push on with. Okay, yeah, so moving on. Meg, just want to jump back to, you said about you conducted a pilot study. So could you tell us a little bit about what that entailed and why did you do that, and what benefits did it have overall for your full research project?
Yeah, so part of my pilot study was that I wanted to sort of test my questionnaire on a similar group of students, but not my actual target population. So for myself, I submitted it to other students at the university, like that were on the same course but weren't sort of in my inclusion-exclusion criteria. So for me, it was students that hadn't experienced learning like prior to COVID, so they couldn't be included. So obviously they were similar in the sense that they were still students. So it meant that they would be able to answer the questions. but just weren't included in my actual population. So by doing that, it actually provided me quite a lot of useful information in terms of like the wording of my question, so the layout of my questionnaire, sort of tell me whether there was anything that needed clarifying so that people could fully answer the questions. And it also allowed me to make changes to my questionnaire to support students with learning difficulties, so people with dyslexia and other sort of learning conditions like that. It's something that I hadn't thought about because it's not something that I suffer with myself. So I thought that was quite important to make sure that it was accessible for all students that were included in my target population.
No, awesome. That sounds like it's really beneficial and just like almost like a trial run, isn't it? So I guess that's what it is, just to iron out the finer creases. And would you say you'd recommend people that are going to do a questionnaire? You recommend that they actually do a pilot study if they're able to, just to try and inform what they're doing?
Definitely. I think if you've got the time and your sort of time frame allows for that, then I would definitely try to include it, just because it meant that I could sort of reconsider some of the wording, make sure everything was really clear in what I was asking. And it just provides you with some really useful feedback and anything that you might want to sort of take out or change just before you put it out, to make sure that the answers that you get back are really in depth and sort of meet what you want them to meet, so you're getting answers directly to that question and not something that's confused with something else.
Yeah, I think a lot of students can kind of go to their supervisors and be like, can you give me feedback on my questionnaire? But ultimately, running a trial run like that is going to give you more feedback and more tips than your supervisor is able to give you. Okay, Esme, so you had a focus group rather than handing out a questionnaire, which is really, really good, and not many students are able to organise focus groups for research. So how did you go about organising that?
So I spoke to, we have someone who's sort of expertise in the patient group. So I was initially looking at using a couple of the patients from our university clinic. So we have a gatekeeper, so someone who looks after the clinic, Jamie. I went to him initially to just sort of see, in terms of in the patient records, did we have anyone appropriate. I know when we were all students and we were sort of like doing our placement there, we had a couple of people that would have been sort of deemed appropriate. You know, sort of after having a look through the patient group, sort of realised post-COVID, which is when I was doing it, there were not as many people that sort of like stroke patients had returned back to the clinic, and in terms of contacts, we couldn't get hold of them. I think we had about 2 which weren't as relevant, so I was then sort of signposted to a stroke group that were connected through the university clinic by Jamie. So I got in contact with them, and then I went over to have a talk, sort of introduce myself and what my research was about, just to sort of like see whether people would be interested in taking part. Luckily, most of them were sort of very interested and wanted to sort of help out in terms of sort of share their experiences for my study. So we sort of arranged a date where, well, obviously consent forms and information forms are handed out, obviously all clinical. But once I sort of like got those back, we arranged a date, and we sort of conducted the focus group discussion. But yeah, no, very similar. Sort of wanted to add on to Meg's point as well. In terms of like piloting, I also piloted my questions that I was going to give to my focus group as well. That again helped me massively, just because in terms of just refining those questions to make sure that they were sort of like really easy for sort of my patient groups to understand, massively helped out. Just give me a moment. I've lost my thought.
You're all right.
I've lost my train of thought.
We're talking about piloting the questions.
No. It's all right. It's gone. But yeah, piloting the questions did actually help like when I actually did deliver, just because there was just a couple of things that I didn't think about, and you can't really prompt the patients too much. You want the focus group discussion to be sort of nice and fluid, and other people to be sort of bouncing off each other. So having those questions sort of like as good as I could get them definitely did help. So I'm sort of not adding my own personal bias into prompting them. I'm getting the answers that I needed from the questions, and not what I expected. I don't know how to quite say it, but yeah.
Yeah, it's almost if you start prompting them, you start adding researcher bias into your questions, and then it's just not conducted correctly, and you're going to start influencing what they say, and then you influence your results, and then it's very hard to extrapolate it and apply it. So it's really good that you do that. And the piloting the questions, I think it's so useful, because although you could think that you've got the perfect question, as soon as you ask it to somebody, they could start answering a completely different question. So making sure, especially with a group like stroke patients, that they're actually going to answer what you're looking for, and that the question is actually tailored to the sort of answers that you're looking for, and that you're getting the right information is relevant to your study. So really emphasizing that point on that piloting the study, and making sure that your study is ready to go, and it's as prepared as possible for when you're in the real thing.
Yeah,
awesome.
It's something it's just something I really wanted to I really wanted to make sure I'd piloted my questions before I was even organising my patients, and getting sort of like an interview, well, not an interview, a discussion ready for them. Because again, it just made sure that on that day that I delivered it, it was all good to go, and was as good as it can get.
Yeah, I think when you're doing something in person, like a focus group as well, it really helps you if you've done it before. You've actually run through it, and you've sort of experienced what it's going to be like, and you're not just throwing yourself in there and in the deep end. Okay, we're going to move over and talk about some of the results from your guys' study. So Meg, will fire over to you. So please could you just discuss some of the key findings that you found in your research project?
Yeah, of course. So part of my research looked at sort of lectures that were delivered online through the pandemic. And one of my key findings was actually that asynchronous lectures, which are lectures that are pre-recorded that you can then watch back, were actually quite a key part of learning. So a lot of students said that they found that they were really useful in terms of the fact that it allowed for flexibility in learning, and that they could sort of go back to them at any time. So they said that they found them really useful for consolidation of knowledge and revision, and then they could use that sort of alongside the practical teaching. Another finding that I found was that face-to-face tutorials were better than online tutorials. So one thing that our university used was just sort of group sessions that were delivered online, sort of in small breakout rooms in little groups. And a lot of students reported that they found that they were actually really difficult to engage in, that a lot of students didn't engage in them, that they had their cameras off through sort of those sessions. And many felt that online tutorials just didn't provide the same sort of sense of community that a face-to-face tutorial provided. And obviously for physio students, that's quite important. We're usually quite a social bunch. People like to sort of bounce ideas off each other and work in groups. So having those online didn't really work as well as face-to-face. That's it.
No, that's really interesting, because physio is usually a really interactive environment. And when we're in the lecture halls, you're making friends, you're forced to work in groups. Obviously, it's just the nature of what we're studying, what we're doing. So it's really interesting to say that people didn't actually prefer the synchronous lectures, and that actually preferred the flexible learning. But I suppose it's really hard to recreate that feeling that you have in class when you're in person. So yeah, it's really interesting.
Yeah, so one of the things that obviously was mentioned was that synchronous lectures were sort of better than asynchronous in the sense of that it was more like a live lecture, like it was more like going to university, and that it allowed for people to still have that social interaction, and still allow for them to ask questions. But the point with asynchronous was that they could then go back to them. So some people mentioned that they might actually be beneficial for things like pre-reading. So then they would then go in and still have a live lecture on sort of a similar topic, or to build on the pre-reading, and then they would be able to consolidate that knowledge and go back to it.
No, yeah, that sounds really interesting. I think a lot of universities will keep some of the sort of learning techniques that we had to adapt to over COVID, because some of them were effective, and I think they'll start to build in a mix of asynchronous pre-recorded lectures as well as the online lectures, which the live lectures, sorry, which are in person. Yeah, really interesting. So we'll fire over to you, Esme. So would you be able to discuss some of your key findings?
Yeah. So a couple of things that I found from my focus group was that a lot of the patients were quite fearful during this time, and confused, just because of the different sort of advice that they were given, and there wasn't a lot of clarity in terms of, most of the feedback they were getting was from the news, and sort of like that can be seen as kind of like scaremongering. So it's like it's always chopping and changing. There was not a lot of support in terms of from health professionals during this time, and I'm more referring to like the sort of the initial start of lockdown. So obviously when all the services had closed, there was like not a lot of health professionals available to sort of like help talk through sort of like what to expect during this time. So sort of a lot of patients felt quite isolated. You got to think, well, some of my patients that I'd spoken to lived by themselves. The only sort of method of contact they had was sort of like either through FaceTime or just normal calls. So they were isolated to themselves at home. And so for that, it's quite scary. You start to feel alone, isolated. There's a lot of things that you're having to then start to experience by yourself. Physically, I mean, right sort of at the start, we were sort of restricted to sort of an hour, if most, of exercise as well a day. So a lot of my stroke patients have sort of said that wasn't enough time for them to go out and exercise. So, in terms of some of them had physical difficulties in terms of mobilizing as well. So, like, by the time they got themselves ready out the door, sort of down the road, it was pretty much time for them to come back. So, I mean, a lot of them sort of experienced reduced amount of physical activity, coupled with the fact that the sort of services had sort of stopped and health professionals are sort of weren't as sort of accessible. In terms of physical mental decline, there was sort of a lot of them had sort of mentioned they'd noticed that. They sort of had sort of said that things like Zoom, Teams, once that had sort of started up, it was sort of really beneficial in terms of contact, because it allowed them to then meet up with sort of other people in their group in terms of the stroke group, sort of then get in contact with health professionals. I mean, during this time, like GP surgeries were just gone to priority patients, and that was it in terms of general inquiries about a long-term stroke condition. They weren't seen as much as a priority. So that was, I think a lot of them found that hard. But yeah, so my big point was, electronical devices and those forms of communication were really beneficial, but otherwise it was quite a scary and challenging time, for them.
Yeah, I think it's a really difficult one, because obviously there was an ever evolving situation. Nobody knew what was going to happen. We didn't know whether it was going to be a few weeks or a few years. Like we had no idea what was going on. I think a lot of the healthcare professionals didn't really know that. So it wasn't almost like, oh, we'll see what happens, because nobody really knew. And when you said about the guidelines, I think there's obviously some people who didn't take it as seriously and people who took it more serious. But I think the people who were worried about their health and had other comorbidities, like your stroke group, would have been taking these guidelines very seriously and making sure that it was only 1 hour outside. But that has such negative impacts, and it's almost like it's very hard to give a guideline for specific people and not just everyone. But yeah, these specific situations really should have been taken into consideration, because if you're trying to do some exercise, it might take a lot. Like you said, you might only get to the end of the road in half an hour, and then that's you turning back. And yeah, it's really not enough, especially when we know how much exercise and getting out can can benefit your mental health. So
yeah. I mean, in terms of for stroke patients as well, I mean, I don't know if it's necessarily relevant, but like a lot of them need to be doing the exercise, especially if they've sort of got like problems functionally, you know, always encouraging this new like neuroplasticity and getting them to do stuff. As soon as they stop doing it, it's like if you stop it, you lose it. Like, so in terms of like the topic itself that I was looking at, I mean, it's so broad, you know, almost needs like someone else to kind of take a small part and then go and look at that individually, because you could just look at like the mental health aspects of COVID, the physical aspects of COVID, you know, and then look at, you know, how much, you know, mobility was reduced in these patients, like this patient group, you know, it's so big, like it's almost like doesn't feel like it was enough time.
Yeah, 100%. I think a lot of people found that with their research project. Although we had 8,000 words to write out, by the time we got to the end of it, I was like, oh, I've said a little bit too much, and had yeah, I've still got so much more to say. Okay, so just thinking back to that, what do you think the biggest factor that affected the stroke patients? Was it the not being able to get out as much? Was it the isolation? What do you think from speaking to those patients?
I think the biggest thing and the one thing that they sort of mentioned the most was the isolation. A lot of them, again, you know, lived by themselves. So it's like when you're living in a family, you can kind of sit down, discuss what's happening with everyone, and you can sort of like digest what's happening. I think talking to people definitely helps. And when most of these people were living by themselves with only, you know, the phone as a method of sort of contact, you're having to sit and basically process what's happening in an environment which pretty much no one has experienced before by yourself. You're sort of sitting and watching the news, which is always telling you something different. And, you know, these people are having to think about it and sort of process how that's affecting them. I mean, the guidelines, like we mentioned before, are always changing. So it's like, what is the new norm every week? And, you know, we don't know how long this will last. And you think doing that by yourself, it's quite challenging, and it's quite scary, because you've got no one really to talk about that with. And I think with the lack of information, like in terms of clarity, especially, you know, you can't just call your health professional up and go, you know, this is what I'm struggling with, I need some help. It wasn't really that easy. Like a lot of them, well, a couple of them had mentioned that they could have almost done with, a lot of hospitals started sort of setting up COVID hospitals. We almost in a way needed a hospital where if you had sort of got like a long-term condition you could go to. I know this is all like in a perfect world, but like, you know, that's kind of what they needed, somewhere they could go and talk and sort of like get the help that they needed with their sort of like their problem.
No, that was one of the questions I was going to ask you, and it was what could we have done differently to help support these chronic patients? But like you said, that place for people with long-standing conditions to go to. Do you think that there was anything else that we could have done to support these patients?
Yeah, no, I think in terms of just maybe setting, it's hard because sort of a little bit later down the line we had telehealth set up. So if we're talking in terms of like immediately, it would have been quite nice to have maybe a telephone line or something like that where they could ring up and get in contact with a health professional, just discuss like, or an expert, just to discuss what's happening and in terms of managing their condition along with what's happening sort of right now. Or maybe something like an information pack, because a lot of them had sort of said when COVID happened, they had nothing. They had no information providing them with sort of like any guidance in terms of their condition and how to manage it during this time. And I know it's one of those things where we don't know what was going to happen and what the next thing was going to be, but just in terms of like managing your condition at home, sort of like exercise wise, just anything in terms of information on what COVID is, or, you know, how to manage your symptoms, how, you know, who to get in contact with if you're struggling. that would have just been really quite beneficial for this sort of like patient group. But so most of that sort of got set up later down the line. But that immediate, they could have just done with some information.
I think the NHS has learnt a lot from the pandemic, and I think we've changed the way, especially with physiotherapy, the way we perceived that we could actually make a difference for people. I always thought it had to be face to face, and it turns out you don't have to be, and that a little bit of support. And I know the NHS was under tremendous amounts of pressure initially, especially for physios. Everybody was getting redeployed. But yeah, that thought about actually what are our patients going to do in this time, and maybe some of us shouldn't all be redeployed to that, because there's still a lot of people that need our help, and we can still do that. We're just going to have to do it remotely. But yeah, awesome.
Yeah, it's a hard thing, isn't it? Because like obviously, I know like during the time you sort of see the stresses that the NHS and health services got put under during this time. So it's always like, yes, we could have done this differently, but like the situation we were in was just the situation was crazy. So it's there's no like perfect. Yeah,
it's in a perfect world, isn't it? And hindsight's such a great thing that we could look back and say. But I suppose it's the learning processes that we can come from.
Yeah, absolutely.
Awesome. Okay, so. Just generally for both of you, sorry Meg, I know you haven't been speaking in a while. If you were to undergo this process again, so completely starting, you're going into your final year again, is there anything that you would do differently? And Meg, we'll start with you.
I think for me, sort of maybe refine my questionnaire a little bit more. So once I sort of got into the process and sort of got probably to January, February time, I realised my questionnaire was quite long. It had 4 sections. There was quite a lot of questions involved. So I think I'd probably make it a little bit more specific to one area of teaching possibly. Just because by the time I came to analyse my data, there was so much to sort of go through and then try and present it. And because there was like qualitative and quantitative data, like trying to sort of visualise those for my project, and then obviously for my article afterwards, there was obviously quite a lot of information to condense and sort of get through. So yeah, I'd probably shorten my questionnaire. And I'd obviously think sort of like a tip for people is just to make sure that you are really interested in the topic that you're choosing. I think it's quite difficult to sort of pick a topic. I think that's something that I really struggled with initially, and sort of went with my first idea. And I think my research was beneficial, and I think it's probably come up with some things that universities might find useful going forward, and it's probably highlighted things to our university, but I think you just need to pick something that you are interested in, because it is a long process, there's a lot of work involved, so you just want to sort of keep your focus sort of on your topic. So yeah,
no, I think that echoes what me and Connor said before when we spoke about our dissertations, and that we had friends that weren't really interested in their topics. They'd just chosen it for the sake of choosing one, and it was a lot harder for them to sit down and do than when we were reading our papers and we were genuinely interested in finding out, or for you guys, you were actually interested in the results you were producing. Okay, Esme, is there anything that you'd do differently if you were to do this process again?
Yeah, I think if I'd have done it again, it's probably similar to Meg. I probably would have refined my questions a little bit and just tried to focus on sort of like 3 or 4 sort of like, I want to say like quality questions, because I had quite a lot, and in terms of that, it then opened my dissertation up massively. There was so much I could have spoken about, which is great in one way, but in another way, like it made the project sort of almost in a way too big. It sort of needed to be broken up into more projects. I mean, otherwise, maybe I would have been nice to do more focus groups, get in contact with more a sort of a wider patient group, more people. That would have been really nice. Or spent more time over a set couple of days doing some interviews. But otherwise, like it's one of those things. I'd never done a focus group before, so like just kind of happy I did it.
No, 100%. I think the possibilities of research are endless, and you can make it as big or as small as you want. But I think, yeah, the thing that's come across from both of you there is that you could have one sort of small area, but it breaks up into so many different areas and it opens up so many different things. And I think that ties it back into the piloting as well. So if you could go back and you've got these sort of pilot questions, and you start to think, oh, I'll change that to get that. But then if you actually realise, like, look how much I'm trying to cover here. Yeah, should I focus on this? Should I actually break these questions down into more specific questions and try and get better answers? So I think it's like that when you do a pilot study, you need to realise why you're doing that pilot study. You're doing it so you can improve it, make your life easier, get what you actually want to do. So don't just kind of do a pilot study for the sake of it. If you're going to do it, make sure you're getting the most out of it. Make sure you're doing it with reason. Make sure you set yourself your goals for it. And you can, like, your aims for your project are completely changeable throughout the whole thing. So you can change what you're doing. So if you do your pilot study and go, oh my God, this is a lot, change your aims, choose one bit, change your title, change everything. It's your research. You can, if you find a slight spin-off that you find even more interesting, go for that. It'll probably make your life easier in the long run.
I think one of the things that I didn't notice is when I picked my question, I thought, wow, I think this is really specific. Now, I've West Yorkshire stroke group, long term. I thought I did it, and then as soon as I started doing my question, sort of exploring it deeper in terms of getting the qualitative data, you're like, oh crap, I should have refined this a little bit more. Which, yeah, it was yeah, it's alright.
Yeah, I think it ties back to the get it started early as well.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, if you're doing this process in February, there's not that much refining you can do. But if you've got it well done before Christmas and you're starting to refine, you can be doing your focus group in February, March, and you're still able to get your turnaround. If May is your submission date. But if you're leaving it until after Christmas and then you're starting to refine, you're not giving yourself the time on top of placements, on top of every other thing you've got to do. And the final year is a big stress. Everyone will know that. Okay, guys, I think that kind of brings it to the end of what I kind of had for you. So do you have any more tips or any just general advice that you'd like to give to students conducting a primary research project? Either of you.
Biggest point for me is get it started early. Like, get your ethics done sort of over summer. Have a list of things that you want to do. Ideally, you could probably get your background written pretty much before you start, within reason, because then it sort of just helps sort of build the discussion and what kind of things you're looking for. The more you can prepare for this, the easier it will be. Sort of, if you've got your ethics done, ready to go, you're looking for participants, you're conducting a group, and then you're off. You're great. Helps so much when you sort of, again, managing placement and other assignments you've got around sort of like university life. So yeah,
you can never be too prepared.
Yeah.
How about you, Meg? Anything else, or just echoing that?
Yeah, it's pretty similar, to be honest. I'd just say, just try and stay obviously on top of the workload. I think once you sort of look at your ethics in the summer, you think, oh, this is quite a lot of work. So I think if you can sort of maybe put together a bit of a projected timetable, discuss that with your dissertation supervisor, see sort of how long they would recommend for certain things, and then just try and obviously stick to that. Like Esme said, get things done early, don't leave it till sort of towards the deadline, and just try and get a draft done quite early and get that in for feedback. I think the more feedback you can get, the better. We were fortunate that we were allowed to submit each section once. So you're allowed your whole dissertation to be read once. Obviously, that might differ between different universities and things, but I think the feedback you get from your supervisor is ultimately going to reflect in your final research project and the grade that you ultimately get. So I think it's quite useful to get that draft in early and get some good feedback.
I wish I'd have known about getting feedback on every section. Don't know where I saw that. Yeah, that might have been specific to you, Meg. Yeah. Okay. I think one thing we both you just kind of skipped over there, but also the importance your supervisor plays. Talk to them. They're there to help you. Don't be pestering them with little simple questions that you can work out by yourself. At the end of the day, it's your research project. You're working at a high level now. You need to be doing your own work, but have a good relationship with your supervisor. They're marking it. Get to know what they're looking for. Get to know how they want you to present it. Everything is related to them, and work with them. Better partnership, just like with your patients. If you can work with them nicer, everything's happy. Everything's happy.
Yeah.
All sunshine.
I think
Sunshine
some of the feedback. I think some of the feedback I got from my supervisor was that I went to the meetings prepared. So that's something I'd recommend. Like, make sure you know what you want to talk about. Make a list. Sort of go to that meeting prepared, so that you then use in the limited time you've got with them to make sure you're getting everything you can out of that meeting.
Yeah, a different point as well. In terms of like being prepared, I think another point that would be quite good is have a look on your library sort of like database on other dissertations. I really thought it helped having a look at sort of like other people's dissertations that had also done sort of like primary research. Just allows you to see how they're structuring things, what kind of things are including, sort of like gives you that nice kind of, this is okay what my dissertation will hopefully look like come, when I submit it. It sort of like makes the whole task look slightly less overwhelming when you've got someone there to sort of like go, that's kind of a guide in a way. Yeah,
awesome. And just add to that, don't just look at one. Look at
multiple.
a few. Take good bits from each one. Don't just set your structure just based on any one, but look for a few, see how they've all done it. What do you like about it? What do you not like about it? Make your own plan, make it unique to you. But definitely use something to guide. Awesome, right guys. Thank you both for coming on and talking about your research projects and giving tips for the students. I think it will be very useful. Thank you for coming on, guys.
Yeah, thank you for having us.